Okay, we're here with episode 4 of Talking Coyotes or Coyotes. And I've got Torry Cook, who everybody knows. Torry Cook, started MFK, and he and his wife, Torry Lynn, live in Southeast Arkansas with their 3 kids. And, if you aren't that familiar with Torry, you know that his wife, Torry Lynn, is very involved in the business, and she's involved in the Coyotes that they have access to, and he'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to ask first, Torry, is, what event or experience got you hooked on predator hunting?
I've heard you ask that question on other episodes, and I was trying to put my finger on one specific event, and I don't guess there's a specific one thing that got me started. I started with the hunting and fishing right off the bat. I was born into it, guess it's in my blood, so to speak. But I trapped with my dad. My dad showed me trapping, and of course, all the other stuff too. And then when I really started getting into the calling side of it, I was still just a kid, and my Uncle Bobby carried me calling. He had an old Johnny Stewart call with Johnny Stewart tapes. And that was my first introduction into actually calling coyotes and predators in general. And he gave me a tape, and it was a recorded rabbit of some kind that I'm pretty sure was a Johnny Stewart rabbit. And I didn't have any kind of call. What I had was a kids Fisher Price little tape player with a speaker about that big around. I mean, I'm talking louder than the call probably played. And I took it behind my parents' house. I've always lived in the country, and grew up in the country, still live in the country. And so I've always had access just right outside my door to learn a lot of those things. So I took that little Fisher Price tape player with the rabbit tape from my uncle out behind the house, called up a gray fox and killed it. And so if I was going to put my finger on one specific thing that kind of got me hooked on it, it was that. And I killed a few more fox with that little tape player, and then did what a lot of people do. I wanted a bigger predator call. Of course, my parents were always real good about getting me anything that I wanted hunting and fishing wise. And then I hit that brick wall that so many people hit, to where it was one of the Johnny Stewart, with the rollout cord speaker.
I had one. Yeah.
And I got that, and I thought, man, I'm just gonna wear them out, kill something ever stand. And I mean, it just nothing. I went from, I'd kill a fox here and there, something like that, but no coyotes, no cats. And so I kind of burned out on it there for a little while. And then I got back into it more out of the challenge of figuring it out. And it took off from there. Once I got going, we started slaughtering the gray fox, and then started killing a coyote here and there. And I got hooked on it then. And then when I couldn't kill very many coyotes, that's what made me focus on coyotes. I didn't want to call up any fox anymore. I mean, it was fun and we would still do it, but I started targeting coyotes and trying to learn, how to call more coyotes. And it progressed from there.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the word challenge, and that's what was attracted to me, was the challenge of calling a coyote in, because it's an apex predator out there, at least in our area, and probably in your area as well. I mean, there's a few mountain lions here and there that you hear about, but right. Now, when did you get into the diaphragms?
Calling turkeys with a diaphragm was my background. I started with the diaphragm. Most people will start with a friction call, but I learned to call on the diaphragm. And again, my uncle gave me a diaphragm turkey call that he had won, and he didn't use it, so he gave it to me. And I think it was a Paul Butsky diaphragm call. I couldn't use it. It gagged. As soon as I put it in my mouth, it gagged me, and I couldn't use it. And again, the challenge of not being able to use it. And of course, all the adults would make fun of me. You sound, when I couldn't make a little noise, they said, "Oh, you calling ducks." And so that really challenged me to learn how to run a diaphragm. And as I got better with it and got pretty good with it, and progressed into calling turkeys and calling in my own turkeys, of course, all with a diaphragm, I started taking my turkey calls, store-bought turkey calls, and I would cut the reeds in it and kind of tweak those calls to make them sound better or for what I wanted them to sound like.
Yeah.
And from there, I started building my own turkey calls. And I built my own turkey calls for a while, got into the predator side of things and started doing some hand calling and was calling in a good many coyotes with hand calls that I built or hand calls that I bought from custom call builders and etc. And I always loved being able to call turkeys with a diaphragm. And I was building turkey calls. So I thought to myself, well, if I can build turkey calls, maybe I can build, since it's all on that higher pitch range,
Yeah.
I thought maybe I can build some diaphragms that I can use predator hunting, and then I'd be hands free. And I just always loved the use of a diaphragm, thought they sounded really, good and realistic. So I started playing with it, and I went through hundreds, if not thousands, of calls that I would build on the kitchen table, test them out howling, test them out for rabbits, birds, different sounds. Didn't sound just like I wanted, throw them in the trash or put them in a Ziploc bag. I still have monstrous bags of diaphragms that I've tossed to the side. I'd cut them and tweak them and
Yeah.
toss them to the side and build another one, stretch it different, stack it different, cut it different. And eventually I started getting, the pup howler, at the time, the TC 2-reed pup howler, which is now the MFK 2-reed pup howler. That was the first diaphragm that I built that I thought sounded pretty good. Took it out and killed coyotes with it. And at that time, it was a big secret. I had no intentions of going in business. I had no social media stuff. I was a real low key, secretive, kill a lot of stuff, don't want nobody to know about it type guy. And some of my buddies started pushing me, like, man, you ought to sell some of these. So I got online, Predator Masters Forum, which I eventually got banned from over killing coyotes, believe it or not. But anyway, got on there and I said, well, I'll sell a few of these just to get some gas money to support my coyote hunting habit.
Yeah.
And a guy that all of you are familiar with now named Jason Grossclose,
Yes.
who I didn't know at the time, buys a 2-reed pup howler diaphragm from me in a Ziploc bag. And it had a little business card that said TC Custom Calls. Keep in mind, this time we don't have Facebook and all that stuff. So he's never seen me. I've never seen him.
Yeah.
I've seen him the call. He goes to that first world championship, wins the world howling championship with the 2-reed pup howler. I contact him, talk to him on the phone. He thinks I'm a 70-year-old smoker because of my raspy voice. So to shorten this story down, he was thinking this guy's going to die anytime. So, we didn't connect immediately, but fast forward. And I don't think 2011 is when we actually met up. I think it was 2010 that he won his first one. 2011, we meet up in Perry, Georgia, and it takes off from there, and like I said, at the time, TC Custom Calls, the slogan was made for killing. And so people kind of started referring to him online as MFK, made for killing. My buddy Dave started referring to MFK in a unprofessional type way, and just amongst buddies.
Yeah. And I know exactly what you're thinking of.
Right. Most people do. And so there is some truth to when that started up, MFK kind of had that double meaning. And, made for killing was a slogan. So it eventually got shortened down. I dropped the TC, and that's how MFK was born. So as far as when I actually started selling the calls, like I said, my turkey background dated back a couple years prior, but I actually consider the business starting in 2009. That's when I started selling the diaphragms, and I wouldn't sell them to people in Arkansas to begin with. They had to be out of state. And that was that secretive stuff. I didn't want people close to me having the calls.
Yeah.
And quickly, that it started growing. And so now, I sell them, and I had to go from being the secretive guy, low key killer to, sharing. And because if I'm going to sell somebody something, I want them to have success. So then I was an open book on like the stuff you're going to ask me tonight, I don't
Yeah.
hold back. I'll tell people, and now it's odd how the roles have reversed, because I get more out of seeing other people having success, killing with the calls, killing with the sounds, than I do myself. So,
Yeah.
complete role reversal as far as that went.
I can totally understand that. And, you mentioned Jason. Now, doesn't he live in Virginia? Where does he live?
Right. He's in Virginia.
And he's got a lot of cows, doesn't he?
Right. That's his main
That-
deal. He's got big cattle operation.
I remember seeing, a lot of his cattle pictures, and I knew that you guys were tight for several years. And
Right.
then you got Kerry Wayne, who goes with you a lot. So he must live there locally, right?
He is. Kerry Wayne, Dayton, they're local. And
Okay.
Kerry Wayne first started promoting this stuff. I'm one of those guys, if I'm going to do it, I want to prove that it works, show people that it works. So
Yeah.
we started carrying a video camera, and Kerry Wayne was running a lot. We swapped it back and forth, but Kerry Wayne
Yeah.
is kind of known as the MFK camera guy, because he's, especially in those early days, and even still today, he would run camera. He would just soon, or maybe rather, be behind the camera as in front of it. So he
Yeah.
done a lot of that, a lot of the filming.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm a little bit like that too. I don't mind running the camera, for somebody. I was the weirdo always taking the camera on vacation, even back when we had the big, the VHS
Right.
thing. I'd be the guy walking around the grocery store filming stuff.
Yeah.
Now talk about
Memories are good.
What's that?
I was saying those memories are good.
They
Good to
are. They
have.
are good memories. Talk about the coyotes that you've got access to, and how long have you had them, and what have you learned from having those coyotes, the access that you've got to them? What have you learned that you didn't know, whatever it is, over 4 years ago?
Right. And the oldest coyotes are 4 years old, or will be 4 years old. So as far as what I've learned from them, in just a short period of time, I would say within the first 2 years, from raising them as pups up until they were adults for that first full year, basically a full life cycle, getting to watch a full life cycle from pups being in the ground all the way until they are fully mature adult coyotes, acting and doing what coyotes do. Because basically what I get to do, the way I raised them, hand raised in the wild, I get to watch these coyotes interact just like coyotes naturally would. And that's been a huge eye opener. There were so many things that I believed from reading magazines, forums, stuff that goes way back as far as what you hear about coyotes, that I believed, and would have called, BS on somebody if they tried to tell me otherwise, until having those coyotes. And probably the biggest thing that I've learned that helps, hunters that are calling coyotes, is vocalizations, and how coyotes really react and respond to that. And one of the first things that I picked up on right off the bat is that a lot of the titles that you see attached to howls are marketing, and a lot of the things that were said about howling and all of that is not necessarily true. And I'll get more detailed with it, meaning that coyotes recognize each other's voice. So if if they are known, right, or even just known resident coyotes in an area, they recognize each other's voice. Along with that, there's a pecking order. So those coyotes know each other, and they know their rank, when they howl. Coyotes also have a very distinct pattern. So, you can have, for example, I've recorded numerous coyotes at this point that I knew the sex of the coyote, I knew the age of the coyote, and knew what triggered them to howl. And you can take multiple coyotes that do a lone howl, and they will have a different version of a lone howl. Some of them will be short with little choppy stuff mixed in. Some of them will be long, what you would typically think of as a lone howl, which would be a long, smooth howl. And when that stuff gets labeled, a lot of times they would call one of them an interrogation howl and another one a long howl. And, they would put all these different titles to howls. And that used to be confusing to me when I first started out, which one should I pick? Which one should I use? Well, this one's a male, this one's a female. And to be honest with you, a lot of the stuff from back in the day and even today with libraries, a lot of these coyotes that are recorded, they're guessing at the sex of the coyote. They're recording them at a distance in the wild or something with a long range mic, and they have no idea what they're recording. But they know that saying this is a female coyote is a better marketing strategy for titling that sound. And I try to be straight up with people. Another thing is, what I'm getting at is, it doesn't matter the sex of the coyote. This is, you talk about what I've learned from the coyotes.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter the sex. It does not matter the age of the coyote. When you howl, when you introduce a new howl, whether it says interrogation howl, invitation howl, lone howl, those are basically all lone type howls. And all you are, in my opinion, from watching and raising coyotes and also hunting, is you're just a strange coyote in the area.
That's exactly what I think. Yeah.
And what's so good about that and really great about that is, for all these people that are starting out, that get a remote that's got 500 sounds on it, and they're looking through these titles of these sounds and they're thinking, what do I do? Well, I'm scared to use this male howl, because they've read somewhere that if they use a male howl, that's going to be a dominant coyote and it's going to scare all the subordinate coyotes and the young coyotes off. I'm telling you that it's not true, because coyotes don't think like humans. So when, let's say you use a whatever howl you want to use, you do that, the lowest ranking coyote in that group of coyotes you're calling to still thinks he can whoop your tail, because that pecking order has not been established between that strange coyote, which is you calling, and the lowest ranking coyote in that pack. It all relates right back to, and this is something people can relate to more, it all relates back to the little bitty dog jumping on the big dog. They don't recognize that until the big dog puts the little dog in its place, and then that pecking order is established. But until that happens, every coyote that you're calling to, for the most part, thinks that it can whoop this strange coyote, or is willing to test it out,
to give it a try. Yeah. And if he's that pack mentality also, I mean, that touches on that, because I find that they're emboldened in numbers. If there's 2 or 3 of them, they're to me, that the ones I've seen are more aggressive about coming to see who that intruder is. Like, we're going to go kick his butt.
Right.
Are you finding that?
I have howled in everything from tiny little bitty pups to big old toothless, dominant coyotes and everything in between. But I do think there is a lot of it has to do, and that's another thing, talking about what I've learned from coyotes, it relates to your point. Every coyote has an individual attitude. So when you raise, like I've got to raise multiple coyotes, you will have one that's timid and shy, and curiosity and all that stuff is different. It's just, and that coyote is not going to call as easy as your more, what you could refer to as your more aggressive coyotes that they just by nature, they have a more aggressive attitude. And you'll see that within just the different personalities of the individual animals. And that makes some of them really easy to call and gets them killed. And other ones really hard, because they're just by nature, they're less, their curiosity level and their aggression to come to the call is not what the other ones may be. And usually that does have, a lot of times that does have something to do with the pecking order, because a lot of times your most aggressive pup or your most aggressive adult, either one, they're usually leading the charge, so to speak, if they're together.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you was, you kind of see that as each litter comes up through, you'll have, there's all in a litter, there's always like one that's kind of the dominant one in a litter, and they establish that pecking order in the litter early on, and do they kind of keep that personality throughout?
Well, right now, a lot of people know I've got a cow I call Little B. She has an extremely aggressive cow or attitude towards all the other cows. She is the dominant female,
Mm-hmm.
and she's actually one of the smaller, lighter weight of the females. And she's extremely aggressive attitude wise towards other cows and stuff like that. But she's also very skittish, cautious, not skittish in that she's timid towards other cows, but she's very cautious. And so I see it both ways with her. And
Yeah.
she would be, when I play with them with sounds and stuff like that, she's one of them that even though she's more dominant uh, as far as the pecking order of the coyotes, she's also more leery of coming to a call or anything like that. And it's just a
Mm-hmm.
personality. It's a lot of that stuff is so unique to watch between the different behaviors of the individual cows.
Yeah, that's just very interesting to me. How, you know, everything you've said so far as you know, the female versus the male, and like the marketing part of that. And,
Right.
you think you're throwing out what's listed on the collar as a male howl. Well, it may not be a male howl. You don't really know. Um,
Right. Well, there's a couple other interesting things that I think you and anybody listening would
mhm.
find interesting as far as those sounds. I kind of break them into your lone, less aggressive type howls, your aggressive type howls, and then you have some howls that kind of fall in between where they're excited, agitated type howls, but they don't really break over
Mhm.
into a true challenge type howl. And that's easier to choose sounds from instead of trying to say, well, this is an interrogation howl, and this is a lone howl, and this is an invitation howl, and this is a challenge howl, and this is a worked up,
Yeah.
trying to break them down so individually. And so what I typically do is if it's a lone howl, then it's a less aggressive type howl.
Yeah.
And you can tell by the way it sounds. And then I have those that are just one step up from that, where they're usually kind of excited, happy, or even slightly agitated howls where you can just tell they're doing some yipping and stuff, but they may not be, they're just worked up. They're a little bit worked up, and it's usually excited.
Mhm.
And I would say that would be the next step up if you were going to compare them on an aggressive scale. And then lastly, you would have those aggressive howls, which would be your screaming type howls and your challenge type
Yeah.
howls, where you would be on the aggressive side of it. So when people are choosing a howl and you want to do a lone howl, just do something that sounds like a lone howl, whether it says interrogation or, for
Yeah.
example, Rue, my oldest female, when she howls, she doesn't have, I don't think she's capable of doing a long, smooth howl. So if anybody were to listen to the sounds from my library of Rue and you listen to her lone howls, then a lot of people would immediately label those as an interrogation howl or, a more aggressive type howl uh, than just a subtle, smooth lone howl, because she just doesn't do them. But
Yeah.
when she does her version of a lone howl, her version of a lone howl sounds completely different than boon or smack or bougie and then other ones will sound very similar. And I've noticed a lot of times litter mates will have a very similar howl pattern. For example, Little B, Bougie, Stanky. Some of these, I've got a cow named Juice, and a lot of people hadn't even heard these sounds. I hadn't released them yet. They have
Yeah.
very similar long, smooth howls. And
Mhm.
if you stacked all of those howls together, they're all lone howls from different coats, and some of them sound drastically different. And that's where
Yeah.
those titles get confusing when you're reading them in a library.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm familiar with Boone and Smack because, I've got a bunch of those sounds and and you got them in progressively as they aged,
Right.
from like whatever it was, 6 weeks and 9 weeks. And, there was different ages on those.
Right.
But, going back to the howls, yeah, for me, it's like you get that first group of howls that you referenced is kind of for me, it's like hey, I'm out here, I'm over here, who's out here with me? Just sort of
Right.
hey, I'm here versus the more aggressive ones,
Yeah.
later. Yeah.
Yeah. I always think of it when I howl, I always think of it. And after watching the coyotes, it's just, I'm a strange coyote and that's it.
Yeah.
That's because after listening to so many of them howl for the same reasons and have different type howls, it got me past the way I used to think. I used to put so much thought into what's the definition of this howl and what's the
Yeah.
definition of that howl. And to be honest, myself nor anybody else, as far as I'm concerned, really knows what those coyotes are saying to each other.
Yeah.
And they have such a difference in the way that some of them howl, the howl patterns, like you said, Smack and Boone. If you listen to both of them lone howling, Boone usually has some little wavers and he does some, some little tricky stuff with his lone howls. Smack will howl at the same time for the same reason and or they'll answer each other with lone howls. And
Mhm.
Smack has a lot deeper pitch, same age males. He has a lot deeper pitched uh, voice. At the time, Smack, who sounds like a big old, burly coyote, he was actually the run of the litter. And those first howls that come from him,
Mhm.
he's a tiny little male coyote that got whooped by everybody. But he sounds like if somebody were to hear those howls at a distance, they would say, "Oh man, that's the big alpha dog out there," and everybody's scared of him. When in
Yeah.
reality, he was the whoop down run of the litter.
Well, and I found that to be true, because I grew up with beagles. So we rabbit hunted my whole life. And
Right.
just same thing with beagles. You had a different bark for each beagle. And it would surprise you sometimes that, this little beagle over here that had the big old bark. It's kind of like, singing. Now, Frank Sinatra sounds different than Elvis Presley. That sounds different than Justin Bieber. I mean, they're all
Right.
different, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, and another thing,
yeah.
people are I found this really interesting, and I get questions about this quite a bit, and I almost forgot to mention it. The imitation house, female imitation. Of course, we're right in the prime time of people using female imitation. And
Mhm.
female imitation, after recording multiple female coyotes howling in heat when they are, alone by themselves and they're howling, when they do a female imitation, they howl over and over and over again, typically. The only thing that separates a female imitation from that same female doing a typical, 3, 4, 5, 6 sequence lone howl is that she continues to do it. She will usually howl, then there may be a 10-second gap, she'll howl again, and she may howl for hours, just howling, howling, howling.
Yeah.
When I recorded Little B in heat, she howled for hours. Of course, she was alone and she just howled over and over, and she might take a short little gap and then howl again. So something I tell people, I always kind of get a kick out of people saying, "Hey, I call this coyote up with female imitation," and they played it one time. So they probably played, a series of 3 or 4 howls, and the title said female imitation, and they think that because it was a female invitation and that was supposed to be a female coyote in heat or something like that, that had something. And really all they did was play just a lonely sounding lone howl.
Yeah.
If they want to do a female, what I tell people is if you want to do a female invitation, keep howling. And if you've got
Okay.
2 or 3 female invitations, for example, if I was going to do a female invitation, when I recorded Little B,
Yeah.
doing that, I recorded multiple howls. Well, you can't put, a 2-hour howling sequence on an ecaller. So I
No.
would break those, she would howl and it might be 5 or 6 howls strung together and then a 10-second break, and then she'd string another 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 howls together. So what I did was every time she did a sequence of howls, I recorded that and I labeled one of them Sexy Little Bee. I labeled one of them Little Bee Lonely Howls, Little Bee Ready Howls. And so if I was going to do, but all of those howls were recorded back to back to back to back while she was in heat doing a true female invitation.
Mhm.
So if I were to do a true female invitation like a coyote would, that was a hot female would that's trying to attract,
Mhm.
a male, then I would howl multiple times. I would let that sequence carry over. And I'm not saying I would sit there and howl for an hour, but I
Yeah.
would string those howls together for more than one series. Because if you do one series of female invitation, you could have picked female lone howls and accomplish the same thing, because all that female invitation is a bunch of lone howls strung together, in my
Okay.
opinion. Because
Yeah.
when I compared Little B's lone howls, when she just howls, let's say she split off and she howls 4 or 5 times and that's it. She shuts down. She doesn't howl anymore. That sounds exactly like, for the most part, that sounds just like the lone howls that she strings together when she's in heat and howls over and over and over and over again. So if somebody wants to do a female imitation, howl more than 3 or 4 times if you want to truly mimic, you know,
Like a female that's
a hot,
searching for a mate, right?
right, right.
Okay.
And if you want to do, if you're just wanting to start your stands or throw some lone howls into your stand that are, lonely sounding lone howls, which is what most people want to start with. And a lot of times they'll skip over female invitation because they're like, well, this is October, November, or whatever time of the year outside of breeding. They think, well, I'm going to skip over female invitation because it says invitation in the title. When you could use that little short sequence that's on your e-call that says female invitation, and that could be your lonely lone howls. Just don't
Okay.
let those titles confuse you, because if you do just that series that, before it sound loops on your e-call,
Mm-hmm.
you've accomplished some lone howls. That's
Okay.
all you've accomplished, in my
So,
opinion.
yeah, well, I mean, and everybody, and that's what I'm after is your opinion because of your experience on the breeding season. We touched on that. What, in your opinion, is the breeding season? As far as the time frame.
February for Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day for, and it's just like the deer rut. I mean, you're going to get some variances in that, I'm sure, depending on, what part of the country you're in. But
Yeah.
I always use Valentine's Day as a reference. Valentine's Day last year, I know that around Valentine's Day, my coyotes, that's when they are typically, you know, dogging is what I call it, where
So
they're actually hooking up.
would it be like a couple of weeks before that and a couple of weeks after, or is it like, what's that?
Pretty much. So you're going to have, let's just use Valentine's Day as the peak. Then you're
Okay.
probably going, so we would say that's the peak for the bulk of the coyotes. Of course, you're going to have some that come a little earlier, come a little later.
Yeah.
So you could pretty much use the month of February as breeding season. So that
Okay.
4-week stretch there, and that could, tail end of January into early March. You might
Yeah.
have some stragglers one way or the other, but I think, just remembering Valentine's Day, the day of love, as it
Okay.
relates to human,
Yeah.
relates coyotes as well a lot. And of course, your pairing is coming prior to that, and then just as soon as that breeding is coming to an end, that's when your denning immediately takes up, because they start getting ready to prepare dens and get that area, that smaller core area, shrinks down, and they start, as far as your mated pairs go, that'll shrink down, and your coyotes will start actively digging dens or cleaning out old dens, whatever they're going to be preparing for pups.
Yeah.
And
So
it's
talk about that, Torry, about, in your opinion, is every coyote, every female out there going to get bred, or is it just certain ones? I mean, how does that work? I mean, I know it's a
I
guessing
think
game.
it is. I mean, the more I learn about coyotes, the more I realize there are no definites or absolutes, just like with most anything. But for the most part, your mated pair in that area, that territory, that's the female that's going to be bred. Other females, and they don't allow that main female, that alpha female, if she's got pups or another female that stays on, she keeps it whooped down, and it usually won't come in heat and doesn't breed. But it may be there with the pups. I've witnessed that multiple times.
Okay.
And so typically what you're going to have your mated pair in what's typically referred to as a territory. Those breed and have pups in that territory. And then that's a lot of times why when you hear, if you go out locating or you're hearing family groups of pups, once those pups get out of the hole, there's usually a pretty good distance. And that coyote density plays a role in that too. But more dense populations a lot of times will have groups that kind of overlap territories. So
Yeah.
you may have them stacked a little closer together. When you get into more sporadic coyote populations, like where I'm at, there's usually, when I'm locating coyotes, when I get groups of separate litters, they're usually a couple miles apart, at least between, family groups. And when you get a
Okay.
little closer, higher coyote population, I think that may tighten up a little bit just because you've got a higher
Hmm.
density.
Yeah.
But
And I think sometimes that density of coyotes is dependent on the food source. If there's a lot of food for them, I think you'll see more coyotes in an area versus, not having enough food.
oh yeah, yeah, it definitely plays a role. That's why some of the, especially some of your western states and stuff like that, you'll have areas that really produce great one year, and the following year there are no coyotes there to speak of. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times you can usually tie it back to something food related, or something has caused them to relocate, or the
Yeah.
area
Well,
not to hold coyotes the following year.
yeah, there could have been some disease that went through the rabbit population or something. I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of different factors involved in that. And plus you could have had something like mange go through the coyote population and thin those numbers down. But okay, on the you mentioned about locating, and I was asking you this before we started this, when because this is always a gray area for me. When you locate coyotes and you hear them out there, when do you decide, like, okay, I can pull them to me, or do you say, well, they're a little too far away, so I think I need to relocate? And I've watched you guys on your show, relocate quite a bit. So
Right.
when do you just make that decision?
Well, where I'm at, it's really thick cover. You can tell from the videos it's thick. The
Mhm.
coyotes don't come from as far. So the area that I'm hunting plays some role into that. But typically an easy way to go about deciding whether or not I'm going to move, open or thick ground, is however far, if I think I can get closer, that's what I'm going to do. So let's say I'm out there and I howl, and I'm doing it while I'm hunting. I'm not just locating, but I'm hunting, and I howl and coyotes answer. And they're a little piece from me. Typically I will shut down and I'll sit there a few minutes in silence. I don't burn their ears. I say burn their ears. I don't call to them anymore. And I'll just sit there and see if those coyotes show up in, 3, 4, 5 minutes. If nothing shows up, then that's when I move. And I always move as close as I think I can get to them without bumping them. So a lot of times in the woods, that's as far as I can see. So let's say I can see 100 yards ahead of me. Well, then I'll move up 100 yards and maybe a little farther if I think they were a pretty good ways out.
Mhm.
But part of it I judge just on how far I think the coyotes are from me. But when you start getting into how close can I get to them without bumping them? It's usually, that's how I'm judging it. How far can I see and know that I've got cover, whether it be a rise. If you're talking open ground, is it a rise or, a fence row or something to block their view? Or in the woods, is it, because it gets thick enough that I can't see past a certain point, then I'll move up. And sometimes that's a pretty good distance. And other times it's, it may only be 25 or 30 yards. When we're hunting thickets and we're
Yeah.
starting to close in on coyotes and they're not breaking and coming to us, because a lot of times the moving is because coyotes have hung up. We have tried to call them, and we get
Yeah.
a few minutes into the stand, and I know those coyotes are only, let's say they're 300 yards from me in thick terrain, either
Hmm.
thickets or woods, timber, whatever. And a coyote at 300 yards, if you trigger him, he should be there like that. So if I play through a couple different trigger sounds, I may hit them with, depending on the time of the year, if I hit them with a couple different things and they don't get there pretty quick, then I'll sit there, like I said a while ago, I may sit there a couple minutes just to make sure they don't show up
Hmm.
silent, and then I'll get up and ease towards them. And that pressure, I'm a firm believer in that the move closer is probably more important, just as, if not more important, or more of a trigger than the actual calling itself. Because you howl from here, and people, you see this nonstop online, people talking, they'll say, I howled, the coyotes answered me, they wouldn't come any closer, they just sat out there and they howled and carried on, and I never could call them up.
And
A
then they
lot
left.
of times,
Yeah.
all they needed to do was just a position change closer to the coyotes. And
Hmm.
a lot of times it doesn't take much. And just
Yeah.
that pressure from you howling from here, and then you move up and you may run the exact same howl again, or you may change to a fight sound or whatever. But it's not so much the sound that I think triggers them, it's that you have pressured them by
Closer.
getting closer to them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That makes perfect sense. And you mentioned it. Uh, Tyler Puckett had a question about call sequences for river bottoms and thickets. And I think what you're going to probably say is depends on what time of the year it is. So let's talk about this time of year. What, talk about a particular, a standard or a routine call sequence that you would go through this time of year.
Are we talking blind calling or calling to where, locating coyotes that are there? Because it
Let's
changes depending.
let's talk about blind calling, like you've gone into a new piece of property and you don't know where they are,
Right.
and you're
Like most people would
yes,
probably be doing.
yes.
Okay. This is the way I approach a blind. And just here recently, I've done some calling and I've tested out some different ways that I call. And I keep going back to the older style of when I first started killing coyotes at the highest numbers. And what I typically do is kind of base it around what we were talking about, just triggering coyotes, because I don't know where the coyotes are at. And when I sit down, I'm assuming I'm assuming that I'm calling to a coyote within, in thicker stuff. I'm assuming that I'm not calling the coyotes outside of, you know, 600 to 800 yards tops. Now,
Mhm.
in open ground, I would assume that I could call coyotes farther. They'll cover more ground quicker. But I'm also, the way I used to call, I would run a sound for a couple minutes, change sounds to a different category. And so that's the way I do it. If I'm strictly calling for coyotes this time of the year, blind calling, I'll typically start my stand with a couple lone howls, either from a diaphragm or an e-call. And those are two separate triggers. When you howl from a hand call or a diaphragm, or you call, it could be vocals or prey distress. When you call from a hand call or diaphragm and you call from an e-call, those are two different triggers,
Mhm.
just because the speaker limits on
Yeah,
any call.
they
I don't care
sound
what
different.
brand it is.
Yeah.
Right. So I try to use both. That I'm more effective with that. People will see me nowadays running the eCall more because I'm promoting the sounds. But if I'm just trying to kill the most coats that I can kill, I'm going to run a diaphragm howl, 2 or 3, 4 howls, and then I'm going to answer it with the eCall or vice versa. You could start with the eCall then hand call. But I'm going to run, 2 or 3 lone howls, answer it with some lone howls. I'll probably wait a minute or so. And then this time of the year, I'll usually go to a pair howl or a group howl. I'll wait a couple of, minutes behind those howls. And pretty much that howling sequence is going to be, a 3 to 5 minute portion of my stand. Whether I'm actively howling or whether I'm sitting there hoping something responds to the howls. And a lot of times it's that the coyote howls, way in the distance and I get up and move. So I'm either wanting those coyotes to tell me where they're at. And if they're close enough, I'll wait on them to come in. But I use those howls right off the bat, trying to, either call a coyote in or get him to tell me where he's at. From there, I usually go right into what I call social interaction sounds. So like I got a sound called submissive beggar that I like to use. And that's when after you howl, a lot of times these coyotes will come back together and they reestablish the pecking order. And it's not anything aggressive. It's just kind of a meet and greet wrestling match where the pecking order is reestablished. So I like to throw, and usually when I run that, I'm going to run about, 3 or 4 minutes tops. And then I want to swap to a completely different trigger category. So that's where I'll throw, maybe a prey distress sound, any prey distress sound. It could be rabbit, bird, whatever. And that gets you, your howls are going to be territorial type stuff. Social interaction could be a crossover between, a social type trigger and a territorial type trigger. Then you get into that prey sound. I'll run it 3 or 4 minutes. That's going to be a hunger type trigger. And then if nothing shows, like I said, I'm thinking I'm calling these coyotes and they should be there in 3. If you ask me about learning from these coyotes, I get to play with them and watch them from a distance. And if a sound triggers them, it's instant. They trigger and they come, or they don't trigger and they ignore it.
Yeah.
So I've started incorporating that more and more with my calling to where I run a sound for, 2, 3, 4 minutes, and then I swap to a different sound, a different trigger category. So once I do howl, social interaction, prey distress, that's probably got me into that. I'm probably getting into that, 8 to 10 minute mark right there. And then I'll usually swap to a pup distress, which is going to be an instinctual type trigger. I'll run it for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll go to a fight sound and I'll run it for, 2 to 4 minutes, somewhere around in there. And that'll usually get me anywhere from, a 10-minute stand on the short side to a 15+ minute stand, depending on how long I ran each sound. Now that's blind calling. If nothing shows up, I get up and go. And a lot of times I will swap out. If I did 2 minutes of rabbit on the e-call, then I may do 2 minutes of rabbit on the diaphragm to make up that 4-minute prey distress sequence, because I'll have coyotes they'll be triggering on, the diaphragm and not the e-call or vice versa. So I'll mix those, those mouth and e-calls together too, to give me another type trigger to see if I can get something to come in. The flip side is,
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, if I was calling, that's how I would call a blind stand where I don't know if there's a coyote in range that's going to come in. If I'm calling located coyotes, and let's say, I've already heard them prior to hunting, I know where they're at, or they howl while I'm sitting there and I think, all right, these coyotes are, within 300-400 yards from me. I think I can call them from right here. Then I will be a lot more patient with that stand. Because I know that a coyote's listening to me, and I know I've got the wind right, and I know I hadn't bumped this coyote, so I know he's still, listening to me call. Then I will basically run that same type sequence, but I may give the coyote a little more time to come, And I will also start, I may go through it a second time. So let's say I ran through with, Boone Longhouse, and then I went with Submissive Beggar, and then I went with Rabbit on the Diaphragm, and then I went with Broke Pups as a pup distress, and then I played Pound Town. Well, then I may come back around and play, and the coyote hadn't showed up, but I know they're still there. Well, I'll come back and hit them with, a pair howl, and then I may hit them with, submissive tap out or garble, and then I'll do, if I did Rabbit distress on the diaphragm, then I may do bird on the e-call. And so I
Okay.
just go through that sequence of sounds again, use those same triggers, but play a different sound and a different type sound. And then when I get to the fight, if I played table scripts the first go around, I'll hit them with, Yo Mama or Pound Town, something like that
Mhm.
to try to get those coyotes to trigger when I know that they're there. And then I may get into those 20+ minute stands when I'm calling coyotes that I know are there.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I tend to stay on the stand a lot longer than most guys, and I guess maybe I get more patience. I don't know, or I'm too lazy to move. Maybe that's it.
Well,
But
and a lot of it relates to how much land do you have,
mhm.
because if you're a guy that doesn't have a lot of ground, I've got tons, and that's something that people, if they're starting out, the most important thing to coyote hunting, the most important thing is access to coyotes, and a
Mhm.
lot of it, because, and I think people think, they get a few thousand acres that they've got enough ground. That won't hold you very long.
Mm-mm.
It takes a lot of ground if you're going to do a lot of calling. And then when you think you've got enough ground, you better keep getting more because you'll burn through it so quick.
Yeah. Yeah,
And those,
that's been my experience in the last, say, 4 years or 5 years, is I've gradually accumulated more and more and more, and now I feel like I've gotten, I feel like I've got enough, but
right.
I'm still acquiring more. But and eventually one day I guess I'll turn some of it over to some of these younger guys coming up through the ranks. But yeah,
Right.
I've told those younger guys that you can burn up a property pretty fast if you're going out there every week,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about it, especially if you're letting coyotes get away. Another thing, talking about what I've learned from the coyotes, and
Hmm.
you bringing that up made me think about it. When I first started coyote hunting, and I heard all the educated coyote stuff, I said, that's people overthinking it. They're not that smart. They don't pick up on it that quick. But I have learned from having them that, I mean, they pick up on stuff so fast, and they pretty much, I will simplify it by saying they kind of chalk it up as to a positive or negative experience. And if it's a negative experience, they don't forget it. I mean, they just do not forget it. And I've had playing sounds. When I was trying to get into predator hunting, I would read about, there were a lot of articles that would say, when you go hit a spot, just pick one or two sounds and play that, and don't show the coyotes anything. Don't show them what you've got in your toolbox, because if they don't come to that, they're probably not going to come. And, so run a 15-20 minute stand with rabbit distress, and then call it quits, and then come back in 2 weeks and hit them with bird or something like that. And I have learned from having the coyote that that's not a very good way to go about it, because when I'm messing with my coyotes, if I let them listen to a sound that they're interested in, that triggers them, but if I let them listen to that sound long enough that they figure it out, or they come in and smell of that e-call or whatever, and they figure it out, then I can wait as long as I want to wait. And I can go back with that same sound, and it's almost instant. They know it's bullcrap. They have learned that sound is not legit.
Yeah.
And so that changed the way that I call. And like we were talking about a while ago on sound sequences,
Hmm.
if if I do the same thing and I trigger those coyotes on a sound, and I get to watch them, and as soon as I see that they're triggered by it, I shut it off, and I don't let them, don't let them listen to it anymore. And that's kind of how I test some of my sounds. is I'll let these coyotes, I can get close to them. I can leave the call 300, or not that far, but a pretty good ways away where they don't know it's there.
Yeah.
These coyotes are comfortable with me watching them. They're in a natural setting, nothing's forcing them to do anything. And so I can play a sound and see how they react to it.
Okay.
If they react positive and it's a sound that triggers them immediately, as soon as they show me whatever their reaction to it is, I don't let them hear it anymore. I can go back the very next day and the very next day and let them hear it for just long enough to see what happens. And it triggers them every time over and over and over because they hadn't figured it out. They haven't
Yeah.
learned what it is. And if you let them learn the sound and figure it out, it'd be just like whistling to your dog and he comes running the first time and you kick him when he gets there. And then the next day, you may wait a little while and you whistle to him again. And he may not come as quick, but you entice him, you kick him again. It won't take long and you won't be able to call him up by whistling.
Right.
Now you may be able to clap your hands and you pet him when he comes to the clapping of the hands. He doesn't have a negative experience with it. So that continues to work. Coyotes and calling them and sounds and educating on them works a lot the same way.
I agree with that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, as far as educating coyotes, I think and I lean heavy towards vocals most of the year, especially if I'm specifically calling coyotes, because when a coyote's coming to a prey distress sound, for one, that's not how typically coyotes find what they're going to eat. There's not something out there hollering and that hollers over and over and over again. So if they get burned coming to prey distress a couple times, somebody misses them or they smell you or whatever, it doesn't take them very long to where even if it was a real animal, that's not typically how they go about hunting and catching stuff. There's not animals out there screaming and, so that's not a necessity for them to function. Where with vocalizing, that's how they communicate with each other. And it's a part of their structure day in and day out. And so I think it's not to say that you can't educate them with vocals and stuff like that, but it's not as easy. For one, they need, it's something that they do anyway. And so I think you can get by with hunting an area longer and call in more coyotes longer, using vocals, or hit those places where you have burned them with prey distress and make that property last a little longer. You can get by with calling them up on vocals for a longer period of time than you can with prey distress. And I'm not saying don't use prey distress because early on a property, that's probably one of the best ways to kill them is just throw a rabbit out there if they hadn't heard it before.
Yeah, and my experience has been, if the colder it is, the more they've got to eat and keep their body temps up. So I'll be more likely to use prey distress when it's really cold versus another time of the year.
Right. Well, you take learning from the coyotes too. I used to call it pup dispersal. Now I know that a lot of the coyotes don't actually disperse when I call it family bust up. So you get to the tail end of summer, first part of fall, that September, October time frame, your pups get up big enough and they may not disperse, meaning that they don't leave the territory of the adults. That's why a lot of people call in, multiple coyotes and they may kill, 3 coyotes and they're all males. They're probably brothers, and then same thing with some of these females, it's used, sometimes they will disperse then, but they may stay on for a full year and still be in the same territory with the adults. But I forgot where I was actually going with that as far as the prey distress stuff.
Yeah.
When that happens, when they do bust up, the family bust up takes place. That time frame right there, which I bow hunt heavy, so I don't get, I don't do a whole lot of calling then. But that time frame from family bust up, so let's say tail end of September through until they start pairing, so say through December, that time frame right there is killer for prey distress. If I was hunting late September, October, November, and even into December, I would be heavy on the prey distress then.
Okay.
Just because you've got all of those pups that are, grown coyotes at this point, and they're out fending for themselves. You've got a lot of coyotes,
Mhm.
they're just getting to that point. I did a video about, when they get their teeth in, they shed the baby teeth and get their big teeth in. And that's when those coyotes really start triggering on prey distress sounds and learning about catching prey on their own. There's adults are not bringing anything back for
Yeah.
them, and they're fending for themselves. And so that time frame
Okay.
there is dynamite for prey distress sounds, and it
I'll
works, year round.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind in the fall. And of course, we'll do it. You and I will do another session before then, so we can get everybody on up to speed on that. And let me ask you one more question, and then we'll wrap this up. If you're on a stand, and let's say you kill one, and you get, say a pair comes in, you kill one, and that other one goes back in the woods, and it starts what I call booger barking. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, what are your chances? What should you do then? Should you just kind of stop calling and call it a day? Because I have very rarely ever gotten one of them to come back in when he starts booger barking.
Yeah, a lot of times I have called them back. Usually it's with a sound like Pound Town. It's usually a fight, pretty aggressive fight sound. And a lot of times when you kill, if you have a pair come in and it's truly a pair, where you've got a male and female. And a lot of times you don't know that unless you kill them, but you
Right.
can assume that this time of the year it's odds are. And so if you can kill, if you have your choice and you think, shoot the smaller coyote, hoping it's the female, then your odds are a lot higher of calling that other one back in, or at least from what I've seen, it seems like the male will come back in. And I have done this multiple times. I did it several times last year. Me and Greg Gallagher were talking about this the other day. I would go to a spot in the morning, call in a pair, and if I killed that female, then I could go back that afternoon and just about, numerous times I could go back and kill the male out of the bunch. And I did that 2 or 3 times last year, to where self-filming, call in a pair, kill one of them, go back that afternoon in roughly the same spot, and usually with vocals, uh, kill that other coyote. Now, there's
Would you,
no guarantee that it was the one that was with it, but
yeah.
I feel like it is.
Would you leave the body of the female there if you know you're going to come back that afternoon, or would you remove the body from the field? What would you do there?
I left them. I
Okay.
left them and killed. I killed a male. One of the spots that I remember specifically. Uh, I called in a pair. Me and Kerry Wayne. Kerry Wayne was filming. We called the pair in. I shoot and
Yeah.
killed the female. Left her laying. I may have drug her 10 foot, to show the camera, and left her laying right there. Got that other coyote to vocalize again before we left, but he never would. We were hunting shotgun range, and he was inside 100 yards, but we couldn't see him.
Was he
So
was he booger barking at you then?
he was no, he was just answering howls again, but he was standing there when I shot the female.
Okay.
They weren't right there together. He came up a fence row from one side, and she kind of cut in towards us.
Mm-hmm.
And they were together, but they wasn't side by side. And I shot her, and he took off.
Okay.
And we sat there for probably, I don't know, a few minutes, and I howled. And he howled, and I didn't burn his ears up after he wouldn't show back up on the vocals. And I came back that afternoon, and right there in the same spot, I howled, and he answered about 400 to 500 yards away. And I cut that distance. I didn't say anything else. I waited about 4 or 5 minutes, like we were talking about earlier. He
Yeah.
didn't show up. And so I cut the distance in half of where I thought he was. And what
Mm-hmm.
I typically do is, when I hear one howl and I estimate the distance, and you get better with this, with time judging them, and I've got decent at it, I'll pull out my map. I'll judge the distance on where I think that coyote is, and I'll drop a point so that because sometimes you may have to loop because of the wind or whatever, and you're not straight lining, but I'll drop a point where I think that coyote is, and then I'll cut the distance
Mm-hmm.
to have the wind, in my favor when I set up on him. And I sat down and killed that coyote in, just a few minutes. I think I howled and then went into submissive beggar and he showed up. And
Okay. Yeah, I'm
was
glad
him.
you mentioned submissive beggar. That's another one that I wrote down while you were talking about it earlier that I haven't used in a while that I need to use again as a sort of intermediate sound during a sequence.
It's a killer sound.
Yeah.
That made me think of one more thing. I know we're just
Yeah.
gonna wrap up, but another good tip for people, something else. And a lot of the brands or companies, or they probably don't like me giving out some of this information, but I like people to know the truth, and especially if they're buying from me, I want them to know the truth. But you see all these libraries that say, mine included, this includes my library. You'll see sounds that say, female estrus, female chirps, hot female this, breeding, they label them so that you know that they're related to breeding season. And that's true. A lot of times those sounds are related to breeding season. But all those estrus whimpers, estrus chirps, and all this stuff that's almost always have female in the title or related to females, all the coyotes do it. The males do it, the females do it, and they do it year round. There's two peaks in it. Breeding season, you hear it a lot, and you will also hear it when, matter of fact, one of my all about coyote videos, you will also hear them do it a lot of times when they have a den of pups and those pups are in the hole. You'll hear it then too. So you can use those sounds, those female, the stuff that's labeled female estrus chirp and breeding sounds and whimpers. I'll use those in the spring of the year, just like I do in the wintertime, and call in coyotes spring and summer, just like you will right now.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is interesting. That is interesting to know.
Yeah, the males do the exact same sound.
What's that? What'd you say?
The males do the exact same sound.
Okay.
I was saying the male coyotes do the exact same sound.
That is interesting. I mean, and that, I know this is, I've geared this toward educating, younger hunters getting into it, but I'm learning stuff. I've learned a lot tonight. Well, hey, Torry, what, tell everybody where
so
they,
did I mean,
huh? You didn't learn anything from, you already know it all. Hey, what?
Hey, I'm learning so much just from these coyotes nonstop.
Yeah, and that's what I'm glad we talked about that earlier, because I was very curious as to what you had learned from the coyotes that you got access to there. Hey, tell everybody where what's the website to get all your sounds and your diaphragms.
Well, the website and YouTube is MFK Game Calls. So just mfkgamecalls.com for the website. And then if you want to watch any of the hunts or the all about coyote videos, they're going to be MFK Game Calls on YouTube. Yeah,
and I've watched several of those, and those are very informative, because to anybody who hasn't seen his YouTube videos, he gets out there with the coyotes and the ones that he has access to, and he, it's just really interesting and cool to see them that close. So, okay, so mfgamecalls.com is where you can find his stuff. Torry, I appreciate your time tonight and all the information that you've given all these young hunters. And I'll wrap it up here. And we'll do another session. I want to do one on bobcats. It won't be as long as this, but I want to do one on bobcats, and then we'll do one like in the fall or maybe later in the summer about rolling into that, just what everybody calls dispersal season, and get back into the prey distress sounds. But we'll stop right here. Hold on.